And wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's links and descriptions of Bert's piece, The Failure of Affirmative Action in the Atlantic. So, Bert, can you tell us a little bit about your life? Because you do mention this in the piece that you started off talking about how a lot of your white colleagues believe that you to be some sort of product of affirmative action when that could be furthest from the case because of how hard it is to maneuver through the bureaucracy of things like student aid. And a lot of your piece talks about affirmative actions in the school system. So let's start off with your mom. There you
go. Yeah. Let's start with your mom. There we go. So my mom is Jewish and Irish. My dad is Black. Both sides of my family have been poor for a generation before I arrived on the scene. And having poverty on both sides, that kind of gave me this window into what poor and working class folks say about policies like affirmative action. There's a lot of stories going on around it, about it. And, what I was exposed to, particularly through my white grandmother, and this is something I talk about in the piece, was just this idea that affirmative action is this suite of policies out there that pretty much guarantees that, anyone who's Black is getting preferential treatment and a free ride to college. And, I've been hearing this from the time I was very, very, very young. I remember in elementary school just kind of being told like, oh, because of affirmative action, going to college is a given. The thing is that I actually was, poor, and I had to go through the process. I went through the application process for college. I've helped other people go through that process, and that all happened, while affirmative action was still in effect. And I got to see what was actually out there if you were Black and poor and applying to school. And, what I experienced for the most part was apathy in high school, on behalf of counselors and things like that. When I finally had to apply to college, and I talk about this a little bit in the piece, but basically at the time that I'm applying to school or applying to college, I'm on my third high school. I've been somewhere between foster and transients pretty much the entire time.
Now, you were getting kicked out for fighting and you stabbed someone. Your story is very similar to that of Ben Carson, right?
And then you pretended to be Native American. Don't leave that out.
So Bertrand says in the piece that apparently let's he's not telling you guys the whole truth here. So Bertrand,
you want no? Let me. I'll do it.
You have to tell the Native American story.
Yeah. So everyone Black will know this. Anytime you are light skinned or you got like a strong nose bone or high cheekbones, there's somebody swearing up and down that you're like Cherokee or Choctaw somewhere in the family. And my dad's family is an old light-skinned family, and they have the same story. And he told that story to my mom, that he was Black and Cherokee and all that stuff. And she told my grandmother, her mom. And so my grandmother's under the assumption that me being Black and Native American, like I'm definitely getting a free ride to go to college. And, I've done the 23andMe. I'm not Native at all. There's nothing indigenous in there. It's all, it's what it normally is. It's, white, white masters and people being slaves. That's how it happens. I don't know what else to say.
And she was under the assumption, right, that, because of the Native, because of the Black, you have this double advantage to get into any university you want to get into, because that's just the way systems work. Native Americans get free everything. Black people get preferential treatment. And because you are both of these magical things, then you're going to get into school. You find out that's not true. I'm assuming you asked a counselor at some point, hey, is there any scholarships for light-skinned kids with good hair that could possibly be Native American?
So by the time I get to high school, so just to take it back a little bit, anyone who's been around like lower white working class has heard some of these, classic stories of Native Americans get better welfare, free college, Hispanic kids can go to hospitals and get free medical care. Asian folks, when they come over, they're getting interest-free loans to start businesses, and that's why they own restaurants. And Black people are getting, first in line for every government job and also getting free college. And so I grew up with that. By the time I get to high school, I don't really believe the indigenous thing anymore. I've been around enough to know like every light-skinned black family says that shit, and it's probably not true. But I let the counselor know. I mean, it says it right there on my report. I always put that I was black. It says it on there. I had tested well in my SAT. I was kind of expecting the counselor would tell me like what was available. Everybody had always told me that there were scholarships essentially just for being black, because that's the information that, poor folks have. They just think you're black, you're going to college. All my counselor actually does is hand me a pamphlet for the FAFSA. If you've never filled it out, it's the application for federal aid. And I was eligible for a ton of aid because, my dad had just got out of prison. My mom was literally missing. But to fill out this form and to get all the aid that I was entitled to, I had to prove that I was in that situation, that I was essentially a ward of the state. But to do that, you need, community testimony on official letterhead. And I'm 17, 18. I haven't even been here that long. There is no community around me. That's kind of, intrinsic to being foster and homeless, is you don't have a bunch of community elders waiting to fill out anything on an official letterhead. So I just don't get the aid that I'm entitled to. And, I moved through an associate's, a bachelor's, and then a master's degree, just accruing debt along the way, even though had I been able to fill out the FAFSA correctly, if I had had those resources, my whole undergraduate education would have been paid for. And, that was back I'm 35 now, so it was a while ago, but I have a younger foster sister who was born in 2000, and I've helped her through her college process and gone through the FAFSA. And now I know everything that I didn't know before. And the process really hasn't changed. And within that process is this thing called additional verification, where they just randomly select folks and ask you for more paperwork, more proof of your claims on your FAFSA. And until you fill it out, until you get everything squared away, they can hold back your aid, and they can hold it back for a whole semester. And if you can't pay out of pocket, you just don't get to go that semester, or you lose whatever little bit of savings you have. And these are the actual resources that have been available under affirmative action. That's the experience for most poor folks, and poor Black folks in particular. What I do in the piece is I take my little personal experience of this kind of patchwork of support systems, this bureaucracy that you have to know how to navigate to even get the aid that's promised you. All of that happens under the old regime of affirmative action that people will soon be, missing when the Supreme Court comes out with its decision. That was my unique experience. But when you expand it, you go to the National Center for Education Statistics, which is, backed by the U.S. Census. And their finding is that for low-income high schoolers, we'll get into that term in a second. For low-income high schoolers, only 14% of them go on to obtain a bachelor's degree. So at a national level, over 80% of low-income high schoolers don't obtain a bachelor's degree. Assuming those same numbers for Black folks, we're in a situation where, again, over 80% of low-income Black high schoolers aren't getting bachelor's degrees. So this idea that folks have in their head that out there is just this affirmative action that's, writing blank checks to help poor Black people in particular get into college, it's just not there. And it hasn't been there. And affirmative action, as we've currently had it, it's been this way since 1978. We've had 45 years of this policy that allows you to consider race in admissions. We have the evidence that it just did not help poor Black people. So that was really the impetus for writing this. It's just that I knew that it wasn't true for me. I have the friends who didn't graduate high school, and then I have, the data from the National Center of Education Statistics saying, yeah, over the decades, poor folks in general, and poor Black folks most likely, have not been obtaining bachelor's degrees. So this makes you look at affirmative action a little bit differently. I start with the story about the working class, and they have these very jaundiced, hostile stories. But even the people who don't have that version, every time that affirmative action comes under attack, a lot of my college educated peers assumed that I was one of the people who would feel that attack more acutely, because there's just this very strong association between Black people and poverty. And as long as that association persists, you can't have a policy that is thought to help Black people without the American imagination going straight to, oh, it must be helping the poorest Black people. But the data doesn't show that. And actually,
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because you do actually talk about that and you do break down a lot of that data in the piece, actually, especially when it comes to Harvard admissions. And when you talk about Harvard admissions, apparently they were criticized for not having a large Black population, but their admissions go up. But what is the class makeup of the majority of the Black Harvard population?
so this is really fascinating because I knew this behind the scenes. Most of the work that folks have seen from me when I'm using data, they'll very often see these qualifiers where I say, if this study also applies to Black folks, this is what the numbers would be. Working with the Atlantic, we're able to be in contact with Harvard directly. And they confirmed for us that they do not track income within race. Harvard doesn't know the income of all the Black students it's taking in. It just doesn't. It doesn't have that data. What we do have, though, is a team of Harvard economists, some of the most celebrated economists at Harvard, wanted to know how many students at Harvard come from the bottom 20% of the income range. That basically maps onto poverty. It's, more or less the equivalent of a family of four living on less than $30,000 a year. This team wanted to know how many students at Harvard come from that bottom group. And what they found was only 3% of the students at Harvard were coming from this bottom group that pretty much matches with the federal poverty line. That went up a few percentage points a few years later to 5%. Now, what you want to add this to is that over the last few years, Harvard has achieved perfect Black representation, in some cases better than perfect representation, so that their freshman class doesn't just match the Black population, but in most years, it's matching the Black population for the age ranges of 18 to 24.
Wow.
Very rare for any elite institution to achieve that. When you add these things together, the way they achieved it was by overrepresenting Black folks from the middle and upper classes. They basically used their resources to scoop up all the wealthy Black folks. So if we take that same study and we apply it to the Black students at Harvard, Harvard lets in about 154 Black students each year. 3 to 5% of them are going to come from this bottom 20%. And that takes you to maybe 7 of those 150 Black students come from the bottom. The rest are coming from the middle and upper class. And I kind of build on this because we have some smaller studies that say in the Ivy League, 40% of the Black students, or the students counted as Black to use the formal language, are from Black immigrant groups, which as a subset of Black Americans, they are our wealthiest, most educated group. Then when you go to Harvard specifically, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's one of the directors of African American Studies, an extremely famous African American professor at Harvard, he's gone on record saying he thinks as many as 2/3 of the Black students at Harvard are going to be the fortunate sons and daughters of Black immigrants, and to a lesser extent biracial children. And this is really interesting for him to say because, of course, Obama is the biracial child of a Black immigrant and a white mother, and his alma mater is Harvard.
Harvard Law Review, right?
So it's a lot of data, but the end result is that over the time that affirmative action has, been a policy in effect, Harvard did it. Harvard achieved perfect racial diversity, but only 3% of those students are, going to be Black students from poverty, which means this has mostly been a benefit to the middle and upper classes of Black folks. And that when we really dig into subsets of Black people, it looks like it's mostly been a hyper focus on the wealthiest segments of the Black population, something not a lot of people know about, and that they, in my opinion, did a little bit of lawyerly deceit in the oral arguments. Harvard's defense or respondent said that 70% of the minority students at Harvard receive some sort of financial aid. Harvard actually gives a full ride to any family earning less than $75,000 a year, and they have bumped it up this year to $85,000, which is more than what, according to the census, 50% of American households make. So getting financial aid at Harvard is not equivalent to being in poverty. They give that to people who are above the middle of the middle class in America. And, you know, one way to look at that is that they're kind of like the Yankees. There's a small pool of Black students who have the resources and have been exposed to what's necessary to achieve, you know, Harvard's standard of academic excellence. And Harvard uses its vast resources to be able to grab them all. And at the same time, it gets the social prestige associated with perfect diversity, or I'm sorry, perfect Black representation.
So